Where in the statute does it give you the ability to cut off federal funding for a university based upon your decision, your determination that they don't have viewpoint diversity? Can you cite to a statute, an authority that Congress has given you to micromanage the viewpoint diversity of a college?
Well, certainly now let's back up.
Well, no. I think that's really important. You shut off a program that provides mental health resources to kids in crisis in Northwest Connecticut. Do you worry about what's going to happen to those kids in Northwest Connecticut and kids all across the country who have lost access to their trusted adults?
I certainly worry about mental health for children and adults all across the country. I certainly do.
At its core, this hearing forced a basic question. When federal dollars are already paying for trusted counselors and social workers who keep children safe, what justification is there for ripping that support away in the middle of the school year?
A few years ago, we worked really hard across the aisle to pass the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, a bill that made changes in our gun laws, but in large part because it was a real priority for my Republican colleagues, also included billions of dollars in funding for school-based and children's mental health. Earlier this year, you did something extraordinary. You canceled $1 billion worth of existing ongoing grants to schools all across the country. And it's extraordinary because you didn't cut off new grants, you cut off existing grants. So in states all across the nation, blue and red, there are now mental health programs for kids that are shutting down, and kids who have been relying on really important adults in their life, these counselors and social workers, are losing access. You know Connecticut very well. You shut off a program that provides mental health resources to kids in crisis in Northwest Connecticut. When they did a survey of these kids and asked the kids who were in this particular program who the one adult was who they would go to if they were in mental health trouble or in response to a trauma, every single one of those kids in that program named the counselor funded by this program. You've shut that grant down. When those kids show up to school next fall, that trusted adult will not be there. You've told this program, as well as all the other programs, that the reason is they're violating civil rights laws. This program has no idea what you mean by that. And I guess I just ask you this. I'm sure you had to weigh, factors in making this decision, but did you worry about what your decision would do to these kids where you've ripped away their counselors and social workers literally in the middle of the program? Do you worry about what's going to happen to those kids in Northwest Connecticut and kids all across the country who have lost access to their trusted adults?
I certainly worry about mental health for children and adults all across the country. I certainly do.
I guess I'm asking specific. You must have weighed this. I assume you weighed this when you made this extraordinary decision to shut down $1 billion worth of mental health programming for kids. Did you worry about what you would do to those specific kids?
Well, what we have to do, I think, and that's what our simplified funding program is going to do, is to put programs into a single grant that's going to the states to be determined how that money can be best used.
But how did you weigh the impact? I'm asking about this specific decision. How did you weigh the impact that, again, these kids in Northwest Connecticut, they literally say, this adult is the most important adult in my life. And you made a decision to shut down that program. And this can be replicated all over the country. How did you weigh the impact on those kids? It's a really cruel thing to do to those kids. So did you think about the impact on those kids?
Well, I certainly can't evaluate every particular program in every school district across the state. There are some areas that need mental health more than there are others. And there were programs in the mental health program that did deal with DEI and with gender issues, et cetera. And it wasn't just about the kind of things that you're talking about. So in totality, as we look at mental health grants across the country, we have to make sure that those programs are being used to serve best in those communities. Yeah. So, therefore, a governor or a principal or a state superintendent would have the best information relative to what is needed in that particular state.
Yeah, we know what we need in Northwest Connecticut, and what we need is for the federal government not to rip funding away from these kids in need in the middle of the service program.
Or to better allocate the dollars you have and provide those professionals across the state that can handle it.
Let me ask you another question. Obviously, we're trying to understand what the Department of Education is doing with respect to the threats you've made against institutions of higher education. In the letter that you sent to Harvard demanding that they make certain changes, you told them that they had to end all of their diversity programs, but that they had to institute viewpoint diversity. That doesn't seem to make sense. How do you tell them to end all their diversity programs, and we assume that this is a mandate that you will make of other schools as well, how do you ask them to end diversity programs while instituting viewpoint diversity? Those seems to be totally contradictory.
No, the diversity programs that we've asked and demanded to be eliminated were the DEI, where they were, those programs actually were pitting one group against another.
Isn't viewpoint diversity a diversity program?
A viewpoint diversity is exchange of ideas that's actually better, absolutely. Now here, because Harvard only has 3%, by its own numbers, 3% conservative faculty, do you think they are allowing enough of viewpoint diversity through that teaching
Where
on
in
campus?
where in the statute does it give you the ability to cut off federal funding for a university based upon your decision, your determination that they don't have viewpoint diversity? Can you cite to a statute an authority that Congress has given you to micromanage the viewpoint diversity of a college?
Well, certainly if, well, now let's back up.
Well, no. I think that's really important. I'm
going to answer your question.
Can you cite a statute? Because you can't cut off funding for universities unless you have a statutory authorization to do so. So what statute gives you the right to tell any university that they have to have a certain mixture of viewpoints?
So here's what happened with Harvard.
No, it's a very simple. I don't mean to provide a being hostile.
Well, I have to give you some.
I think you have to cite
background.
the statute.
The statute's Title VI. These were civil rights violations. That is why we filed a case and defunded or stopped the funding for a while for Harvard as well as we did Columbia. And in that conversation with them, we talked about different things that they should do coming back to the table to make their programming better. The president of Columbia absolutely indicated, as well as the president of Harvard, that they needed to do things on their campus to eliminate anti-Semitism. That was kind of the crux of what brought us into talking to the different universities. And then we sat down with them to say, okay, these are other issues that you need to address on your campus because you do receive federal funding. Under federal funding, if you are breaking the law, which they did under Title VI.
I don't understand any conception of civil rights law to give you the authorization to micromanage viewpoint diversity on campus. That's not authorized under the civil rights title provided to you by the United States Congress. Thank you very much.
The answer given by the department, a move toward a single consolidated grant and vague civil rights claims, doesn't come close to meeting the burden of proof required when children's well-being is on the line. The practical harm here is immediate
I certainly
and clear.
worry about
School-based
mental
mental health programs are not interchangeable line items.
I guess I'm asking
they create
specific
relationships.
You must have
Kids
weighed
in
this. I
crisis
assume you
don't call
weighed
a
this when you
hotline.
made this
They go to the
extraordinary
adult they
decision to
see
shut
every
down
day,
$1 billion
the
worth
counselor
of
who
mental
knows
health
their
programming
name
for
and their
kids.
history.
Did you worry about what you would do to
in
those
Northwest
specific
Connecticut,
kids?
where every
Well, what we
child
have to do, I
surveyed
think,
named
and
the
that's what our
same counselor
simplified
as the
funding
one
program is
adult they
going
would
to do,
turn to in a
is to
crisis.
put programs
That's not a
into single
statistic.
grant
It's a
that's going
lifeline.
to the states
Canceling
to be determined
funding
how that
mid-program
money
tears
can
that
be best
lifeline
used.
away,
How did you weigh
disrupts
the?
continuity
I'm
of
asking
care,
about this
and
specific
risks
decision.
measurable harm.
How did you weigh
Increased
the
crises at
impact
school, gaps in
that,
treatment,
again, these kids in
and more
Northwest
strain
Connecticut,
on
they literally
emergency
say,
services and families.
this adult is the most
Even
important
if the
adult in my
department
life.
believes
And
consolidation
you
will be more
decided, you made a
efficient in the
decision
long run,
to shut
transitions
down
must
that
be
program.
managed so they
And
don't create
this can be
acute harm for
replicated
the
all
very
over the
children
country.
these programs were
How
built
did
to
you
protect.
weigh the impact
There's
on
a
those kids? It's
policy
a really
argument
cruel thing
embedded
to
in
do to
Murphy's
those
question
kids.
about
So,
weighing costs and
did you think
benefits
about
that
the impact
deserves
on those
unpacking.
kids?
Well,
Consolidating multiple
I certainly
grants
can't
into one
evaluate
block
every
grant
particular
can, in
program
theory,
in every school
reduce
district
administrative
across the
overhead,
state.
but
There are some
only if it's
areas
done
that
with
need mental
safeguards,
health more than there
grandfathering for
are others.
existing proven
And there were
programs,
programs in
phased
the mental health
transfers,
program
clear
that did
metrics
deal
that protect
with
evidence-based
DEI
services,
and
and
with,
explicit protections for
gender
grantees
issues,
that
et
serve
cetera, and it
high-need
wasn't
students.
just about the kind
What
of
we
things
saw
that you're talking
instead
about.
was
So
an
in
immediate
totality,
cancellation
as
of
we look at
ongoing
mental health
programs,
grants
with
across the
officials
country,
saying
we
state
have to
or
make sure
local
that those
officials should decide
programs
how to use
are
the
being
money.
used to serve
That
best in
abdicates
those
federal
communities.
responsibility
So,
at
therefore,
precisely the
a
moment
governor or
kids
a
need
principal or
federal
a state
consistency.
superintendent would have the
It also
best
ignores the
information
reality
relative
that not
to
all
what is
local
needed
systems
in
have
that
the
particular
capacity,
state.
equity,
we
or
know what
political
we need in
will to
Northwest
preserve
Connecticut,
the
and
most
what we need
vulnerable
is for the federal
programs,
government not to rip
especially
funding away
programs
from these
serving
kids in need in
marginalized
the
students
middle of
that have
service
historically
program.
Or to better
relied on federal
allocate the dollars
support.
you have and provide
Murphy's
those
follow-up
professionals
about
across
Title
the state.
VI
in
and
the
the
middle.
department's
ask you
actions toward higher
another question.
education
Obviously, we're
raises
trying
a
to understand
second
what the
related
Department of
concern.
Education is
When
doing
enforcement is
with
used
respect to the
selectively
threats
or
you've
without
made against
transparent evidence,
institutions
it
of
looks
higher
less like
education.
protection of
In the
civil
letter that
rights
you
and
sent
more
to
like
Harvard,
political
demanding
micromanagement.
that they make certain
Title VI
changes,
is designed to
you
protect
told them
students from
that
discrimination.
they had to end
If a
all of their
university
diversity
is found to be
programs,
violating civil
but that they
rights
had to
protections, the department has
institute
tools to
viewpoint
investigate and
diversity.
remedy that. But
That
using
doesn't
such
seem
authority
to
as a
make
bludgeon
sense.
or to
How
demand
do you
sweeping changes to
tell them
campus
to end
programming
all the
without
diversity
clear
programs? And we
statutory
assume that
grounding
this is a mandate that you
undermines
will make
both
of
academic
other
freedom
schools as
and
well.
trust in
How do
federal
you
oversight. The
ask him
department
to
must
end
be able to
diversity
show the
programs
legal basis
while
and the facts,
instituting
and it
viewpoint
must apply
diversity.
any
Those seems
remedies
to
in a
be
way
totally
that preserves
contradictory.
students'
No,
access to
the diversity
education and
programs that
supports,
we've asked
not curtail
and
it.
demanded to be
There's a
eliminated
human
were
cost
the
to this
DEI,
procedural vagueness.
where they were
When
those
federal
programs
officials send
actually
messages
were
that grants are
pitting
being
one
cut
group
because
against
some
another.
programs allegedly
Isn't
contain
viewpoint diversity a
impermissible
diversity
content,
program?
local leaders and
Viewpoint
school staff
diversity
feel
is
pressure to
exchange of ideas
self-censor
that's
or
actually
to
better,
abandon
absolutely.
programs that
Now
work,
here, because
even if
Harvard
those
only has
programs are the
3%
very
by its
reason
own
a
numbers,
child
3%
stayed in school
conservative
or
faculty.
accessed
Do you
mental
think
health
they
care.
are allowing
The
enough
worst
of
outcome
viewpoint
is not a
diversity through
policy
that
debate
teaching
about
Where in the
DEI
campus?
or
where in the
viewpoint
statute does
diversity.
it give you
The
the
worst
ability to
outcome
cut
is
off
that
federal
kids
funding
who have
for a
come to
university
rely on
based
counselors no
upon
longer
your
have
decision,
them.
your
So what should
determination
viewers
that they
take
don't have
away, and
viewpoint
what can they
diversity?
do
Can you
right
cite
now?
to a statute and authority that
understand
Congress
that
has
these are
given
not
you to
abstract budget
micromanage the
battles.
viewpoint
They are
diversity of a
fights over
college?
whether children
certainly
will have
if-
consistent access
well,
to
now
mental
let's
health
back
care.
up.
Second,
No, I think that's really
demand
important.
transparency
No,
and a
I'm
careful
going to answer your
transition
question.
plan
When you cite
whenever
a
federal
statute,
funding is
is you can't
restructured.
cut off
That
funding
means
for universities
insisting
unless
that
you have
ongoing
a
grants be honored
statutory
or at
authorization
minimum
to do
phased
so.
out with
So what
replacement
statute
services ready.
gives you the right
That
to tell
evidence-based
any
programs be
university that
protected
they have to have
and
a
that
certain
any civil
mixture
rights
of
enforcement be
viewpoints?
accompanied by
So
clear
here's what happened
findings
with
and due
Harvard.
process.
It's a
It's very
place in
There's a
simple.
Columbia.
human
I don't mean to
cost
be.
to this
I don't mean to
procedural vagueness.
provide a
When federal officials
being
send
hostile
Well, I have
messages
to
that
give you
grants
some.
are
I have
being
to give
cut
you some
because some
background. The
programs
statute's
allegedly
Title VI.
contain
These
impermissible
were civil rights
content,
violations.
local
That is
leaders
why we
and school
filed the
staff
case
feel
and
pressure to
defunded
self-censor
or stop
or
the
to
funding for
abandon
Waffle Harvard
programs
as
that
well as we
work,
did at Columbia.
even if those
And in
programs
that
are the very
conversation with
reason a
them,
child stayed in
we
school
talked
or
about
accessed
different
mental
things
health
that
care.
they should do
The
coming
worst
back to the
outcome
table
is
to make
not
their
a policy
programming better.
debate about
The
DEI
president
or
of
viewpoint
Columbia
diversity. The
absolutely
worst
indicated, as
outcome
well
is
as
that
the
kids who have
president of
come to
Harvard, that
rely
they
on
needed to do
counselors
things
no
on their
longer have
campus
them.
to eliminate
So what should viewers
anti-Semitism.
take
That was
away,
kind of
and
the
what can they
crux
do
of
right
what
now?
brought us into talking
First,
to the different
understand
universities.
that these are
And then
not
we sat down
abstract
with them to
budget
say,
battles.
okay,
They are
these are
fights
other
over whether
issues
children will
that
have
you need to
consistent
address on
access
your
to mental
campus
health
because
care.
you do receive
Second,
federal funding.
demand
And under
transparency
federal
and a
funding,
careful
if you are
transition
breaking
plan
the
I
law,
am
which
well
they
aware
did
of
under
that.
Title
I
VI.
know. I
That means
don't
that's-
insisting
I've
that
answered your
ongoing
question.
grants be
It was
honored
Title
civil
VI.
rights
or at
law to
minimum
give you the
phased out with
authorization to
replacement services
micromanage
ready.
viewpoint
That
diversity on campus.
evidence-based programs
That's
be
not
protected
authorized
and
under
that
the
any
civil
civil
rights
rights
title provided
enforcement
to
be
you
accompanied by
by the
clear
United States
findings
Congress.
and due
Thank you very much.
process.